Hello, friends. This is your host, Prashanth Daniel, and welcome to the Reasonable Truth Podcast, a program dedicated to helping Christians understand, articulate, and defend their faith as winsome ambassadors of Christ. It's good to be back again on the show. Last year, the last half of the year was super busy for us. We had our Gravity conference in California. We had a really good turnout. As soon as I got back from that, we ended up moving to a new home. The kids started school. I started a new job. It was a wild end to last year. And so it is nice to be back here on the podcast. And I have some good friends joining us on the show today. I have Pastor Stephen Feinstein. He's the pastor of Sovereign Way Christian Church in Hesperia, California. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Prashanth. I'm very glad to be here.
Awesome. And of course, the other person needs no introduction. He's my partner in crime, my colleague, Carlos Pamplona. Carlos, welcome to the show, buddy.
Hey, it's good to see you, Prashanth, and I'm glad we're back together because Pastor Steve was over at the conference with us, so I'm happy to be back together.
That's right. That's right. You know, Stephen, I'm trying to remember when was the first time. Well, I actually think that I remember Carlos talking about you a few times, but the very first time I actually met you was when you came over to Carlos's house to do some training. Like, I think it was like kickboxing training or something like that. That was the first time I saw you.
Yeah. We were doing Jeet Kune Do, Filipino martial arts, Muay Thai. We were probably dripping in sweat. And I remember you coming out into his garage and Carlos is like, hey, this is my buddy Prashanth. And so, yeah, that would have been the first time. I remember.
Yeah, that's right. Carlos, you remember that, right? I mean, I'm trying to remember what was what was I there for again? Was it for the previous conference or that's what I was there for, was it?
It may have been the previous conference. I don't think it was this latest conference. Well, it could have been. Now the thought leaves me. I don't know.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
I think it was summertime or close to it, and it would have been the one before. I think when you guys were getting ready for the Biola conference.
I think so. I think that makes sense because I remember us discussing afterwards that we did not want to do a summer conference and we decided to do it later in the year last year. So that's right. Yeah. So that was my very first introduction to Stephen. And then after that, I don't think we kept in touch much after that, hardly. And then last year, of course, Stephen and his church were very gracious in hosting our Gravity conference right there at Sovereign Way. So that was fantastic. Stephen, I know I've said thank you before, but thank you again. That was really great. It was wonderful.
It was our pleasure. I think it was awesome to see all the people show up that did show up. And it was just a good program you guys put together. I was impressed and just very glad that we were able to be a part of that.
Yeah, it was really good. And I actually remember Carlos was sending me pictures of the venue several months before, and he took pictures of every room, the breakout room, and all these things. And I was like, man, I love that sanctuary. That looks wonderful. And then to actually be there, and it was filled to capacity. That was a sight to behold. That was really beautiful. And Stephen, actually, what really stood out to me, obviously, like you said, I may be a little biased. I do think we had great sessions. It was fantastic. But one of those sessions that I really enjoyed was your session. My wife and I sat in on that, and you spoke about artificial intelligence, technology, transhumanism, and all that stuff. And until that point, I hadn't really, I'd heard like little clips of you preaching, but that was the first time I got to sit in on your class and actually listen to you talk about that. And you did a very, very good job. I really liked the way you broke it down, and you're an excellent communicator. You're very articulate, and you're a very systematic thinker as well. And I remember both my wife and I walking away thinking, that was a really good presentation. That was really good. And so I think it was probably the end of the same day, I was already plotting in my head to have you on our podcast. And maybe, God knows in the future, who knows, maybe have you speak at our next conference even, but yeah, I thought you did a great job at that breakout session.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. A lot of work did go into it, a little bit of stress. I didn't want to let you guys down. But it was my dumb idea in the first place. I remember throwing that idea out to Carlos probably even a year before that. And I touched on it lightly when I was preaching through Genesis and we got to the Tower of Babel. So that it had been on my mind. And I remember when I took my ethics class at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, we always have to emphasize the definite article. That's what Al Mohler has put within us. But I remember when I took the ethics class, I had to read this book called Enough by Bill McKibben. And man, after reading that, it kept me up at night for a while, because he wasn't writing it as a Christian. He's just a regular secular, futurist who's talking about these things and telling us the trajectory and the stuff that he was bringing up. This was back in like 2004, 2005. I'm like, oh my gosh, we're now seeing some of the stuff he was talking about. So what I really wanted to do is be able to frame that with the biblical worldview as our lens, so that we aren't terrified over these things, and we know how to rightly how to rightly approach these subjects, and yeah, just think in a way that sanctifies Christ in our heart when it comes to these issues.
Yeah, and Carlos, I do want to remind you to not keep interrupting us, okay, when we'll try to talk. So I'm just kidding. I want you to jump in, man. Feel free to jump in and just give us your thoughts. What do you think? How did you think that? Well, I
Well, my
don't think
mother,
you didn't sit in on Stephen's session, right? But tell us your thought about the conference in general.
well, first, my mother taught me never to interrupt people while they're speaking, so therefore I can't do that. She, Mama knocked me out. No, but no, no, for sure. No, I think the conference went well. I think everybody there did a great job, and then I know that the people there were very happy, and they even asked us if we were thinking of doing this again, and they were really asking about when we would upload the footage, and so I was really pleased to hear that, and I know a lot of people benefited from that. I don't think Steve and I think our sessions were at the same time, possibly,
They
and so that's
were.
why I wasn't able to sit on his lecture. So that would have been great, but I heard a lot of good things. So yeah, I think it was good, and I think it was a good talk because talking to so many people, everybody that I talked to either was on one extreme or the other, right? No, nothing's going to happen, or they're afraid of AI as if it's going to turn into the Terminator and something's going to happen, and so they're going to wipe us out. Kind of reminds me of one of our professors, Clay Jones, where he would talk about how we created this beast, and all of a sudden this creation takes over and kind of turns its back, kind of like the garden 2.0 revisited,
Hmm.
But all that to say, I think it was a good conference, and I was really pleased to hear about Steve's talk too. So it was good.
Yeah, interestingly enough, Stephen, I don't know, maybe Carlos has already mentioned this to you, but he and I are going to be speaking at Gateways. They have a foundations conference coming up in March. And I'm actually going to be speaking on the topic that you spoke about
Oh, that's
on
awesome.
AI and transhumanism and all that stuff. And so the preparations have begun. So there you
I
go.
noticed that because I'm on their email chain, and so I saw that. I'm like, oh, cool, looks awesome, and that's a pretty good stage to be on. I mean, at a seminary apologetics conference. So I mean, I think that's man, that's a big deal for you guys.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. I think it's going to be fun. It is. Carlos was just telling me the other day that our former professor Kevin Lewis is going to be also one of the speakers at that conference. So it's kind of it's a weird sort of surreal feeling for us to have sat in his class and sat under his tutelage, and now to be actually sharing a platform with him at this conference is a very gratifying feeling, and so that's nice.
Hmm.
All right, gentlemen, let's go ahead and get into some of the fun stuff. Well, Stephen, actually, I think the probably the right thing to do is to kind of start us off with a little bit of your story. I mean, if you can, uh, give us like a bullet point version of your testimony and and then kind of your entryway into the pastorship and all that. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, boy, where do I start? Wells, West Philadelphia, no, just kidding. So yeah, born in 1978 to Jewish dad, Catholic mother. Um, wasn't raised religious at all. So we were, for the most part, just pretty much, I'd say, like a secular Jewish family. One thing I knew is that Jesus can't be the Messiah, but I'm automatically going to be saved because I'm part of God's chosen people, and He saved us out of Egypt. Didn't matter that I was eating ham and shrimp and all that stuff that we weren't supposed to. But all that to say, there came a point in high school, 16 years old, me and my two best friends thought it would be a great idea to drive around after school for my car shooting people with the BB gun. And we did tag quite a few people, and we thought we were having the time of our life. But my friend Thomas, you likely met him at the conference as well. He tagged somebody in the leg, and the BB actually went into the person's leg, and he was bleeding a lot. So they airlifted him to Loma Linda, had to do a surgery. They thought it was a gun, and then lo and behold, it was just a BB. But it turns out he was a fire captain's son. So there was a full manhunt for us. Eventually, we were found. Uh, and boy, we got felonies and all that stuff. Now, eventually, I was able to get that sealed because I was a juvenile, and so it took time. But I remember being in juvenile hall, and I remember a Baptist preacher came and he gave the standard Turner Burn type sermon. There was nothing deep about it, but I wouldn't say I was a deep person at that time, but it was enough to really just shake my soul. So for the next 6 months, I would say that's when John 6:44 was happening. I was being drawn to where now I'm interested in things that are spiritual. Now, of course, I was accepting answers probably from anywhere and everywhere, but that button was activated in me. And of course, God was drawing me in a specific direction to get to him. And about 6 months later, the one friend I was still allowed to hang out with, I was still 17. And by the way, we got expelled from school and everything. It was kind of hard to make up all those units, but that my buddy that I was still allowed to be friends with, his girlfriend was a churchgoer, and so because he was with her, he had to be a churchgoer. I just wanted to get out of the house, but at the same time, I was feeling drawn to God, and so I asked if I could go to church with them. And within 2 weeks, I'd say I was saved. Now, it was a Church of Christ, so their theology is off in a lot of ways, but I heard the gospel there. I repented, I believed, and I wasn't the same. Right away, I was impressed upon the fact when I was reading some parts of the New Testament how Jewish it was. I'm like, wait a minute, I thought this was supposed to be a different religion. Why are there all these Jews here? These are Jewish names. The 3,000 Jews became believers on the first day of the church. I mean, what's going on with all this? And so that really showed me that Christianity is not what I thought it was. There's definitely a lot more to it. And so, of course, I couldn't put my Bible down. I got baptized. They gave me my first Bible. I was reading probably 10 to 20 chapters a day of it until I hit Leviticus. And then I'm like, all right, I don't know what to do with this. And so then I jumped to Matthew, and man, I'm reading about Jesus, and I couldn't stop. I knew then I wanted to be a pastor. Now, it was going to be a while before I became a pastor because, Church of Christ, I didn't trust their colleges. And I think that was the Lord giving me discernment there. So I went to a secular school, got a history degree, became a history teacher. And that's around the time I met Carlos in martial arts, was right when I was becoming a history teacher. But I always wanted to get back focused and get back on that trajectory to end up in full-time ministry. And I do know that in that meantime, when I was teaching history, I was obsessed, I would say, with apologetics. I've always been, maybe it's in my my Jewish DNA, but I love to argue with people. I love to just like, let's get to it. What's your argument? I'll give you mine. I'm gonna win, so let's just let's do this. And so I would say that I was unbalanced because of that. I had a buddy who put it this way. He said a lot of guys become believers and then they jump into apologetics before they have their systematic theology and before they have their biblical theology and biblical studies. And it's kind of like, imagine a person going to the gym and they're only working out their trapezoids and their triceps. They're going to look like some, hunched over Bigfoot, but the rest of their body's weak. And I would say that's where I was. And so I lived in a very immature way. I didn't have a very loving attitude. And so it was later, just to make the long story short, I decided I wanted to go into ministry. And so the vehicle that I chose was the Army chaplaincy. And so I knew in that case, I had to go to seminary and get a graduate degree in some sort of theology. And so as I chose Liberty for that because they were the cheapest and they were going to be the fastest track to my goal. And so that's where I got the stuff I was missing. I got the systematic theology and the biblical studies, and it rounded me out a bit. And I think it did prepare me for ministry. But then when I was all done with it, I wasn't able to get into the Army active duty because they have a requirement that you have to be a full-time pastor 2 years. And I was a high school teacher. Now, they did accept a waiver. And so if things would have went perfect, I still could have got in, but it didn't work out. And so they offered me the reserves. And at first I was not interested in the reserves, but then they offered to give me a $10,000 bonus and pay off $20,000 of my loans. And I am Hebrew. And so I'm like, okay, this sounds good. Show me where to sign. And I joined the reserves. And then at the same time, I was asked to be a assistant pastor at my church. And so, and I was still a high school teacher all at the same time. So now I was like tri-vocational. And, you know, I ended up doing that for some time. 2010, that church I was at, the senior pastor, he was into some sin and he was unaccountable with money, unaccountable with his attitude. So we tried to correct him in-house. He refused. He manipulated the bylaws to fire anybody who questioned him, and to more or less just make him leave the church. So a number of us decided, you know what, we can't stay under this guy. He's a Diotrephes. And so we planted Sovereign Way Christian Church in 2010. That's the church I'm a pastor of now. After 7 years, the church was at a point where it could bring me on full time. So I left the teaching profession. And by the way, in all that time, like while I'm planting a church and working 3 jobs, I also completed my certification in biblical counseling from ACBC. I completed my MDiv from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And a couple years later, got my THM at Gateway. And I'm not planning on stopping. I just, you know, taking a little break right now, but eventually I'll go for my doctorate. And so that's the fast version.
Very good. Yes, that I really, I mean, all of that is remarkable. I think you've obviously accomplished a lot, and you're definitely a go-getter. There's no doubt about that. But the kind of the earliest part of your story, the way you began as this delinquent youth, if you will, that is the wildest intro testimony I've ever heard in a while. So that was really fun. That was really fun to listen to. Thank you for sharing. So now that you're a pastor, Stephen, let's get right into it. We live in weird times right now. Weird times, and it seems to me like I say this a lot, that when we started, like even when Carlos and I started apologetics, or when I started apologetics back in like 15 years ago, amateurly, the questions were all very different. They were all just sort of the classical questions, you know, like where does God allow evil, or, you know, evidences for the resurrection, all those kind of things. And the questions today are so different. We are now asking questions that for millennia, we human beings have considered to just be conventional wisdom, and all of that is on the debate table right now. So we are definitely in interesting times. What is it like for you as a pastor, who I consider pastors to be on the front lines? What is it like? What are some of the pastoral challenges that you face with your congregation specifically? You don't have to go into details or anything, but with just the general landscape in general.
You know, I could split this 2 ways. So what's the same? Because you're right, things are very different. And when I was teaching, I was telling Prashanth earlier how I went to a winter youth camp to teach the kids about the LGBTQ revolution just a few days ago. Gave 3 lectures on it, and those kids were taking, each lecture took over an hour, and they would not stop asking questions. They would not stop taking notes, because this is what they're facing. And I remember telling them that when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, they told my generation that we were for us, it was the hardest time to be a teenager in any time in history. Now, I don't know how they quantified that, but as a 16-year-old, I heard it and I believed it. And what I told these kids is what we had to face is nothing compared to what they have to face, for exactly the reason you mentioned. I mean, things that are conventional wisdom, things that any 4-year-old toddler can tell are true, are now on the table for debate. And when you say those things that are obvious truth, you're violent, even though you're just speaking. You're causing harm and all that kind of stuff. And there's a massive amount of political pressure, manipulation, and really they're going after these youth hard. And so that's different. Also, I would say the way we address race and how that's come to play in the church is different now than it was when I first became a believer. What's the same is our number one idol is still comfort. This is American Christianity. People don't even want to go to church when it's raining outside. People certainly don't want to love their neighbor like they love themselves and go and preach the gospel to them. And so because of that, I would say a church like ours is a lot more mature than a lot of churches because of the level of teaching we do. But that idol of comfort still, I think, constrains people from doing what we all know Christ put us on this earth to do. So we end up with some of the same problems that a lot of churches would have, such as, people will be on fire for a while and there will be a lot of participation in ministries. And then there might be like a 6-month period where people are just drawing back for some reason, for no there's like nothing in the air. There's no circumstance that leads to that. I think it's just, as Americans, people think they're entitled to their 15-minute break every 2 hours of work. And so if we think of ministry that way, well, if I serve God for 4 months, then I should have 6 months off. And that's just not how it works. And I don't even think people consciously are thinking that and making that decision. It's just what they do. And so as a pastor, I would say that's my hardest fight, because it's that comfort, that lackadaisical stupor that allows the LGBT revolution to sweep in right underneath our noses, to where our average parent doesn't know how to help their kid that comes home and says, I think I might be I might have same-sex attraction, or I might be in the wrong body. Because that stuff happens, especially if you're putting your kids in the government schools. This is a social contagion. It's spreading. So I would say that ends up, those two things, the old and the new coming together, have created a perfect storm where we have our work cut out for us, if that makes sense. There was something that was, oh yeah. So we have our work cut out for us. Just to give you an idea, like besides just marriage counseling, like people having marriage issues and finance issues and stuff like that. I mean, I've had a church member come up to me and say, I paid a lot of money to send my kid to Biola, and my kid came out of Biola hating white people and believing that there's white privilege and stuff like that. And so when people say this is a boogeyman, CRT is a boogeyman, and just racist white evangelicals just don't want to reflect honestly on race, that's not true. There have been people who've gone to Christian schools, came back hating white people, and came back on the spectrum of LGBT. Okay, I've had to have that talk with the parent and how to counsel that parent. So the people on the platform, Big Eva, as they like to call them, or whatever, I don't know how valid that term is, but when they act like these aren't serious things, they are. And maybe because these people are on their platform and they're not in the trenches, they're not the ones having to console that parent who just dumped $60,000 to send their kid to a Christian university that has now turned them into a Marxist radical. And so those are things we have to deal with. And the LGBT revolution is framed now in the critical theory Marxist lens. And that's why one reason it's so successful. So we're having to deal with all of that, every bit of it. And then all the old problems we used to have to deal with, they haven't gone away. So again, our work is cut out for us.
Hey, Stephen,
Yeah.
as you're talking about that, and the church is facing that, would you say also that parents too, to some degree, haven't done their job in really catechizing and training their own children? Because it seems to me, at least I've seen in the past, that people expect the pastor in the church to do all the equipping, when we as those in the church, whether in leadership or in lay leadership, are trying to help out. And so we have these kids who we're trying to feed into. Do you think that the parents are not doing enough on their part to really model it, and as opposed to just being weekend warriors? What are your thoughts?
100% yes, 1,000 times yes. From the beginning of this church, we always said that our children's ministry is a supplement to what parents should be doing at home. And if at any time it became clear to us that the parents have passed the torch to us, as if we're now to do what God has really given them the responsibility to do, then we will blow that ministry to pieces. It's only meant to be a supplement. But in answer to your question, that's exactly what's happening. Going back to that winter youth camp I was at, it wasn't for our church, but the fact that these kids, I was told they wouldn't be able to listen more than 30 minutes. I went an hour and 15 minutes on my second lecture, and those kids would have let me go another hour if I wanted to. And the adult leaders that were there they did not stop writing down. Their eyes were big and they were just sucking this all up. And so I'm thinking these leaders are probably the most involved parents as well. And they don't even know this stuff, right? So how are they teaching their kids this stuff? They're not. And just some of the questions these kids were asking, I would be willing to bet my yarmulke that if their parents heard them ask those questions, the parents would be upset. Not that upset that how could they not know that their kids are dealing with these things, right? Like if I saw my kid asking all these questions about the LGBT revolution, I would have to ask myself, how did I not know that they're being inundated with this stuff? And now they've already got the vocabulary in their head. Because here's the thing, this was one thing I pointed out in my lesson to those kids. Once you accept their vocabulary, the vocabulary in a hidden underneath the surface way already changes the way you think about something. So you're using their terms. And when you're using their terms, you're already borrowing from their worldview. You're walking into a fight where they're going to win because they're handing you the gun that's unloaded, and all that kind of stuff. And so parents are not doing their job. And I don't know what to say about the folks at Sovereign Way. I think some parents are doing their job. I think some might not be. But what I do know is in the youth group, whenever they have a question and answer session, again and again and again, when the kids have the right to ask the questions, they are almost always asking about the LGBTQ stuff. They're not asking about the problem of evil. Some will. Like that might come up every now and again. Maybe one kid will ask that, but then 6 kids will ask about something that has to deal with LGBTQ. And there'll be an hour-long Q&A. All those questions get answered. 3 months later, the same questions come back. That shows us how hard they're being inundated with this. And honestly, I think their parents, by and large, are not aware of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the Christian church needs to pick it up in the area of theological anthropology for sure. But also, like you said, linguistics is usually the first boundary to fall in any ideological warfare. I forget who said it. Some tyrant probably said it a long time ago. But if whoever controls the language controls the narrative right away, and so yeah, so it's absolutely important that parents are in touch, that they have their finger on the pulse of what their children are experiencing and going through, not just in school. Like like this just happened to us a few days ago. My son Caleb, he's my oldest. He's 12. He's in middle school. And the other day, he came and he told us something. He's like, Dad, I'm kind of seeing these things around me. Some of my friends are looking at these things and they're doing these things. And in that moment, I have to be careful in how I respond, because if I'm like, what is going on there, and you make sure to stay away from all the, like if I just blow up like that, then that is going to communicate to him that I'm not a safe person to have these kinds of conversations with, and I want him to be able to, I'm glad that he was able to trust us and come to us and talk about that. And so we were very gentle and we listened and we addressed it and we talked about it, and so it was great. But yeah, I do think that's exactly right. I do think parents are the first level, the first institutional authority that God has placed over children, and so if they don't do their jobs, then it's all downhill from there. So speaking of generations, one person I've really been reading over the last several years is this author by the name of Jean Twenge, and she does a lot of good writing and research. I would actually say she's probably the foremost expert in the field of generational studies, and so she's done a lot of studies on I think she's University of San Diego, if I remember correctly, but she's done a lot of studies on Gen Z, on the millennials, and she's pumped out a few books. And her most recent book is called Generations. And so, which actually kind of brings me to Gen Z. What is your take? I mean, obviously, there are lots of people who have opinions on Gen Z. We have actually done a whole podcast where I interviewed Dr. Harry Edwards, and he's done his dissertation on Gen Z and evangelizing to them and things like that. But I think a mistake we make sometimes is we always tend to poo-poo the generation that comes after us, right? I mean, that's always how it's been. It's been that way with the greatest generation, with the boomers, with the, Generation X, that would be us, I believe, and then probably every other generation after that. But would you say that the Generation Z now is bringing something unique to that challenges the church in any particular way, or what is your assessment of how we should engage Gen Z?
Yeah, I actually got a lot of thoughts on that. Before I answer that, I just want to say clearly, unequivocally, Gen X is superior to all other generations, just for obvious reasons. I mean, the builders, yes, they fought World War II, they survived the Great Depression, but they spoiled the heck out of those boomers. And then the boomers just neglected us and let us go and play and do all sorts of bad things, and it strengthened us. And so, I'm just kidding. But what bothers me, I guess, about Gen Z and the later millennials is the fragility. That even the mere disagreement with them or questioning what they call their truth causes them sometimes to melt down, to where universities give people safe spaces where they could just go and be by themselves, um, because they're being harmed just by other people who have different opinions. So that is a challenge, because again, you said that he who controls the narrative, controls the debate and all that, and is going to win whatever culture war. That's true. But also he who's able to shut down the debate in the first place. So to set things up and to create a people so fragile that you can't speak the truth to them without them being so offended that either they get violent towards you, and you hit one of these guys, this is the martial artist in me talking, they're just going to collapse. They're not, there's a lack of a fortitude in them. That being said, Generation Z though brings a lot of things to the table that are good, and I would say are welcome, because
Right.
the boomer generation brought us seeker sensitive Christianity. Seeker sensitive Christianity is a plague. Okay, seeker sensitive Christianity is, how do we appeal to your idol of comfort? How do we bring you as spectators and fans rather than followers and disciples? How do we get you to pay a tithe to us while we ask the least amount of you and pretty much expect no commitment from you? Instead, you pay us, we'll hire big staffs, we'll build mega churches, and yeah, we'll look successful by a CEO model, but Jesus is looking and saying, I'm about to pull my lampstand out of you. The good thing about Gen Z is they see through all that. They're like, that's all fake. Those pastors are fake. That's a big production. There's no authenticity there. It's all just one really bad sales pitch. Like, this is a used car salesman that got mutated with a TBN, type of
Well,
personality.
and to quickly add to that, Stephen, I think what actually uniquely equips them with the ability to, like, they all have these BS sensors inside of them. And I think
Yes.
one of the things that has actually equipped them with that capability is because this generation they are digital natives. They spend their entire lives. They were born in the age of the smartphone and social media. And so they're very familiar. And so when they see something online, they know what's fake, they know what's not, and that same sort of discernment to some degree carries over into reality as well. I actually have read some very interesting studies on Gen Z, in the sense that Gen Z seems to be a little bit more perceptive about authenticity than even
Yes.
their previous generation, the millennials, were. And so
Yes.
they are not swayed by the charisma or the charismatics of a pastor. They want to see true authenticity. They actually are interested in hearing sermons or lectures or talks that are convicting. I think the problem for them is their reputation sort of precedes them, and people seem to
Yeah.
think that they don't have the capacity to, and that's not the truth, actually.
Yeah, you're 100% right on that. And when it comes to what you're saying there, they're able to see through the fakeness, and they also want to see vulnerability. So as a pastor, it helps them to know I fail every single day, and I'm not trying to present
Yes.
me or my family as something we're not. Because in the past, it was always said, hey, you can't let the church see any sin. You got to look picture perfect because you're the model. But that's fake. And really what that does is that sets up hopelessness for people, in my opinion. Gen Z doesn't want any of that. I've been told a lot of times that, you know, there have been times where me and my wife got salty with each other in front of people, where we were fighting, and that's not good, right? It's not good. But I've had people tell me it was refreshing for them to see that. And I'm like, okay, well, thanks. You know,
Let's do it again.
let's do it again. You
Right.
saw my sin. You now realize I'm a real person. But yeah, I think that's good, because we're able to, if they can see that we care for them, because they do need community. They're in isolation because of their devices. Also, that whole cyberbullying and all that, that's real. That affects them a lot. So to have a real incarnational community gives them something that they need, that they're lacking. But if it's done with the authenticity that doesn't have the baloney, then that's how you're going to win them. The big obstacle is they've been conditioned to believe that the LGBTQ is the civil rights issue of our age. And so Tim Keller, and I know some people in our camp will be like, how dare you mention him? He was a compromiser. Look, nobody's perfect, but a lot of what that guy said was amazing. And he brought up the fact that in any given culture and time, there are defeater beliefs, things that as soon as you say it from Christianity, they automatically ruled out. If you go to a Muslim country and you bring up divinity of Christ or the Trinity, automatically they stop listening to you. Well, one of the defeater beliefs for Gen Z is anything other than a full-on embrace and celebration of LGBT is seen as hate. And so that's an obstacle we have to get across. If we can get into a conversation with them, they are willing to listen to reason. You know, and if we could get there and we could bit by bit show them our authenticity, our love, and really just the gospel, we have that chance with them. It's just, that's the big hurdle. It really is. It's not an easy one to get over with them.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that unfortunately they are victims of this idea, that the fallacy that your what you believe frames who you are, and so they identify with whatever it is they believe, and so then if you push back against that belief, now it is perceived as you pushing back against their own personal identity, or dehumanizing them, or whatever it is they want to call it. Which actually brings me to this very important issue, and I want to step deep into this. And Carlos, I really want your thoughts on this as well before we go into our break. But we live in a time now where it seems to me that narrative matters more than the facts. And I cannot tell you how many times over the last several years I listen to something on the news, on mainstream media, I read something on Twitter or whatever it is, and I see this back and forth, this sort of conversation or debate that's happening, and clear facts are being mentioned and data is being provided, and it has zero effect on the other person. And but the power of rhetoric, the power of narrative seems to be so powerful that I just shake my head. I'm like, there are days when I wake up and I'm just like, we can still do this. We still need to train people in critical thinking and logic and all these things. And then there are other days I wake up and I'm like, we're doomed. We're doomed. This is over. Like this, like there's no turning back from this, because the narrative matters more than the reality. And so for me, when I look at these things happening, I'm like, there's a lot of institutional responsibility here that has been broken. There's a zero trust in a lot of the institutions in media, even in academia, or even in the medical field. Like COVID exposed a lot of this stuff back several years ago. And so it's created this environment of distrust. How do we as Christians try to navigate that in such a polarized and suspicious culture?
Can I speak to that first? Real
Yeah,
fast?
go ahead, man.
Please.
Honestly, I think it's a welcome. I think it's a welcome thing. And here's why. Facts don't speak for themselves. Every fact is interpreted through a narrative. As a card-carrying presuppositionalist, a Van Tillian, I have to say that. And so all facts are going to be filtered through our network of presuppositions. And the fact is, people, when they have facts that counter their presuppositions, they find a way to discard them. Now, that's not good, right? Because a fact is a fact. And if your narrative is worth anything at all, it is the one ring to rule them all. It can absorb all facts, and it'll have a place for them. And so their narratives don't meet the transcendental preconditions of intelligibility. Ours do. So I love the fact that that is being acknowledged now, because it really overthrows the false confidence in human reason that modernism gave. So in some sense, postmodernism in that way is a breath of fresh air, because if we compare narratives or meta narratives and we compare worldviews, we are going to win every time. Here's where it becomes a problem for us. The reason it's a problem is because the levers of power, like media, the mainstream media, the education system, and the entertainment industry, and the algorithms of the social media industry, they all have the ability in a 24-hour cycle to push one kind of narrative, one kind of messaging, and to silence and make another narrative, an opposing one, sound crazy. So if it was an even battle and we were able to show up and it's a unbiased, objective debate, we would win every time, and we would win the country back to the Lord so quick. But the institutional levers of power, the same ones that the Nazis were able to use in less than 10 years to turn their whole country, are also being used against us in the same way. That I'm not sure how we overcome. But on a one-on-one conversation with somebody, I welcome the fact that they're coming at it from a narratival standpoint, because I'm going to win since they are doing that. My narrative's better.
Carlos.
Hey, Steve, you mentioned a word, and maybe some of the listeners may not understand that word. You mentioned transcendental intelligibility. Can you unpack that just briefly so that they can get a hold of that?
Yeah, the transcendental preconditions of intelligibility are what are the things necessary for us to make sense out of anything? What's necessary for reality to be real, right? And for us to even be having this conversation. So one of the transcendental preconditions of intelligibility is inductive inference, or the uniformity of nature. If nature's not uniform, if I drop this pooter and it does not fall at the same speed every time. If we don't have a uniformity of nature, then you can't have predication. If you can't have predication, you can't have knowledge, because knowledge depends on you being able to actually learn something and lessons from what came before. But if what's going to come tomorrow is operating on a completely different set of laws of what happened today, then what you learned today is irrelevant. So obviously we live in a world that has predication and uniformity of nature. That's impossible if the fundamental reality of all things is randomness and chaos, because randomness is the opposite of uniformity and predication. So right away, we know the atheists are wrong. So another transcendental precondition of intelligibility would be the laws of logic. We cannot function without logic. But what is logic? Logic are immaterial laws of relationships between categories and classes. So I can know there are no 30-foot tall people in China, even though I've never been to China, because I could just, use the following syllogism. No human is 30 feet tall. There's humans in China. Therefore, there are no Chinese people that are 30 feet tall. That simple. I don't have to go look at all 1.2 billion of them to verify that. Most of what we know actually comes from the laws of logic and us being able to reason and walk through these things. Now, think about it. Logic is not material. I can't pull it out of the closet and say, here's logic, now let's kill it, and it disappears. One way that Greg Bonson used to illustrate this is he would maybe write the number 3 on a board and say, what is this? And then people would say, that's 3. And then he'd erase it and say, so I've destroyed 3 from existence. Well, they're like, well, no. And he's like, well, then what was that? Was it really 3? And then they realized, no, that was a symbolic representation of 3. He's like, okay, so what is this? They'd be like, well, 3 fingers. If we cut them off, does 3 disappear? No. 3-ness as a concept is not material, and it's not contingent upon anything physical in the world. But everything that's physical is contingent upon these immaterial laws of logic that are immutable. Well, if these are laws of thought and relationship, then they must come from a mind. Not that they were created like God fashioned logic, but they exist as a byproduct of his mind. Logic is original to God. It's derivative to us. So we can't know anything without the inductive inference of the uniformity of nature. We can't know anything without the deductive inference of logic. We can't even begin to possibly live without moral absolutes. So what would be necessary for moral absolutes? Well, we know, as C.S. Lewis said, there's clearly a moral law. Everybody all over the world seems to recognize it. If there's a moral law, what is the transcendental precondition of that? There must be a moral law giver, because laws just don't come from nothing. So those would be the three classic examples of transcendental preconditions of intelligibility. If you don't have those things, then there is no knowledge, there is no knowing, there's no doing. Everything does not make sense. We can't make sense of anything. And so that's why I like the narrative approach, because if somebody's coming to me with that, I could say, all right, let's take your worldview, let's define it. Now let's see if your worldview could account for uniformity of nature, laws of logic, and moral absolutes. Theirs can't, ours can.
Very good, gentlemen. Well, obviously, Stephen, I want to get some more into the weeds with you. And when we come back from the break, I want to bring this down a little bit and make it a little bit more practical, really, turn up, amp up the Christian theology aspect of culture and how Christians need to think about this. And so we have a lot more we are going to discuss. But before we do that, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. So stay tuned. All right, friends, welcome back to the Reasonable Truth Podcast. We are with Pastor Stephen Feinstein and Carlos Pamplona, and we've been having a vibrant conversation about the culture and how does Christianity fit into that? What are the prisms, the framework through which we can think about these kind of things? But I want to switch gears here a little bit in the second segment, and I want us to talk about sort of what are some tools, what are some resources, Stephen? Because when I, for those of us who have some degree of training and we do a lot of reading and things like that, we are familiar with, first of all, being able to assess or analyze what's happening in the culture, but we also are equipped with certain tools to discern and to even engage. But the average person is not. The average Christian is not. And so for a lot of people, they don't have the time, they don't have the bandwidth to go to seminary, they don't have the time to go buy a bunch of books and read and things like that. And I'm not saying we should give them shortcuts. There are no shortcuts. But are there general tools and resources that a Christian should pursue or should at least use in trying to exercise discernment when they're looking at these kinds of really sometimes polarizing, sometimes controversial or difficult issues in the culture? Give us sort of a Christian blueprint, if you will, to be able to analyze these social cultural issues.
Well, I don't know if there's any shortcuts, because ultimately these polarizing issues are issues of worldview, and this is what. So let me frame it this way: you go back to when we were kids. There was a Christian veneer to the society, which meant that the Judeo-Christian worldview was assumed. So the things we would argue with people about in general were still under the umbrella where we shared the assumptions of our worldview. That's why transgender arguments were not even possible, back in the 80s and 90s. If people were trying to make them, they weren't making them like they were today. And they definitely would not have been received. So we are in what they call a post-Christian society. And so you have to ask yourself this: if you were to send a missionary to a country that is unchurched, is there any way you could just send him maybe with the cheat card, that to where he's going to be able to go make converts and plant a church? No. That's the reason why we make all of our missionaries have their MDivs, at least, with an emphasis in cross-cultural studies, because there really are no shortcuts. And I think as our country becomes increasingly more pagan, with less Judeo-Christian worldview still there, these issues can only be dealt with at the worldview level. What is a man? What is a woman? What makes up identity? For example, Freud is the one who first pushed the idea that your identity could be reduced down to who you have sexual desire over. Now, we know biblically that's not an identity marker, that's a feeling. That's how you feel, not who you are. Who you are is you're made in the image of God, male and female, he made them, it's binary, right? And so we come with that worldview apparatus, and that's how we're able to address these things. if the average believer is unwilling to learn to think in worldview terms, they're not going to be able to really engage this culture. So for example, because I do want to give an answer, because it sounds like I'm saying there's no hope, no shortcuts, but let's say like one that I would argue that people should become familiar with is Greg Koukl's Tactics. I don't agree with everything in that book, but it is accessible to anybody, right? But to even make sense of his Columbo tactic, you have to assume the Christian worldview. And to be able to use the boomerang and all those things on your opponent, you have to know ideologically where they're coming from. I understand the idea of learning to put them in the hot seat and make them justify what they believe, but some of them don't feel like they have to justify what they believe. And they don't think
Right.
that if there's inconsistency in what they're saying, that there's a problem. So I believe it's incumbent upon the church to make sure that they're teaching their people, not just Sunday morning sermons, but worldview and all that has to be covered there. But that's why at our church, I taught a church history class. I taught 3 systematic theology classes. We have them recorded. I'm going to be teaching the 30 hours of biblical counseling. And by the way, that's going to be my main answer to your question. Pick up and read anything written by the biblical counseling movement, Nothetic counseling. They give you the theology and the practical, easy steps, if you will, of how to think about any issue biblically and to move towards transformation in more of a, I guess you could say, a Christocentric way. So yeah, I would say biblical counseling is going to be the key way that we equip people and help them. But yeah, I wish I could say this book will help you. And honestly, if I were to say anything, I'd be like, hey, my second edition of my apologetics book that's going to be coming out, that's the one that really trains you in worldview and all that. But you know what? The average Christian might have to read that 4 or 5 times before they actually have it all in their head. So I don't, maybe I'm wrong on this. Maybe I'm not the right guy to ask, but I just look at the terrain and I think, no, what our people need is boot camp. You can't just hand some untrained person a uniform and a gun. You got to send them to boot camp in order to make them prepared to fight this war. And I feel we're in that kind of war.
Carlos.
Piggybacking on what he mentioned about like worldview, I think that's essential because, in First Peter 3:15, the first section of that, before you give an answer, he says what? Set apart Christ in your heart. So you have to be completely devoted to Jesus Christ. You have to know who he is, and whom's been forgiven much will love much, right? And there's that ethic that says that they shall know you by the love you have for one another. So I think first and foremost, to have a Christian perspective, a Christian worldview means that you're going to see all of life through the lens of what it means to be a Christian. That means not just what you do on Sunday, not just that which is spiritual and what you do in private life, because it becomes Gnostic in that sense, right? There's a physical application because we're dealing with reality here. And so I think if a person reads their scriptures all the time and they're spending time in prayer, if they're actually, what does the Bible actually teach about life, human sexuality? What does it talk about economics? What does it talk about politics? What does it talk about end times? What does it talk about how I'm supposed to engage? I was reading an article not too long ago about being winsome. And this whole concept of winsome sometimes I think is a detriment because we're playing
I
by
think
enemy
I think I know
rules.
where you're going with this. We've had
Yeah,
talks about this.
yeah, and I think sometimes there's this thing where we're playing by enemy rules, and yes, we have to be charitable and kind, but you can't always play by enemy rules because they expect you to act a certain way. So along the training portion, we have to train our people, and I completely agree with Stephen. We have to be building the people that talks about in Ephesians, right? Equip the saints for the good work, for the ministry that they've been called to. And so a while ago, you guys mentioned something about the comfort that we have here. We have too much comfort. And so the question is, have we truly believed? I was just listening to a few lectures and reading about Andrew Fuller. So Andrew Fuller was an 18th century theologian, one of the greatest minds in Baptist history. And when he became a believer, one of the things that troubled him was this antinomianism, that is lawlessness that Christians believed, easy believism, as well as living any way, because unless you felt led, unless you felt God convicting you to change your life, you wouldn't do it. And one of the things that kept him awake was that if we believe in Christ, it's going to transform how you live. And so I think that there's still a lot of that in our culture where we're so comfortable or we're not really believing it. We believe it, but it's on the outskirts. It's not central, like what Peter said. Make Christ your center. So I think those are important things to consider. The training, and you know what? Another thing too, I would say, is use the rhetoric back. Augustine, in his Christian doctrine, talks about how rhetoric is it's a neutral system that is used by the opposition effectively. And if Satan can use it effectively, how much more should we who have the truth wield it effectively? Because it does a few things. One, it kind of shocks the mind, but it also draws them when you can actually use words in a way that points light to the gospel and brings glory to God. So I think that in authentic living, really living out the message that we talk about. Because if we don't, like you mentioned, Stephen, people will actually see us as frauds. But if we're living it out and our talk matches our walk, then I think it's even more engaging and it seems more real.
I think, yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I also think that rhetoric, or the art and science, because I think it's both, the art and science of rhetoric requires that we use words sometimes as a scalpel and sometimes as a machete. And it just depends on the situation. It depends on who you're talking to. It depends on what the topic of discussion is. But now, again, I could very easily see someone taking this out of context. And, we're not supposed to bash the person down. We're not supposed to be rude. That's not the point. But the point is, going by sort of the modern, evangelical definition of winsome, if you will. I don't even like to use the word evangelical these days because it's so loaded. That, Jesus wasn't always winsome in some of his interactions with a lot of people. And so I think being firm, being strong, standing your ground, using, even if that means just raising the tone of your voice to really stand your ground for the truth, then by all means do that. And I think that's a very important tool to have in the Christian's belt. But I want to go back to something you said, Stephen, about sorry, not Stephen, Carlos, you said this about looking at everything through the Christian lenses, right? I mean, it's interesting because this reminds me of Christopher Watkin talks about this in Biblical Critical Theory. He talks about Augustine didn't have to explain the Bible to the Romans, right? But he explained Roman culture within the framework of the biblical story. And so, and if you want to flip it around and turn that language into more like accessible language to lay people, then you can use C.S. Lewis, if you will, who says Christianity is like the rising sun, not because you see it, but because by it you see everything else, I believe is what he says. So yeah, just I think the great value of recognizing and seeing everything first through the Christian lens, through the biblical lens, is automatically going to take care of all the pixelization of culture, the dust that you see on the lens through which you're looking at. And I think that's a very, very important first step for Christians.
It's because if you think about it, how can you detect a counterfeit if you don't know what the actual thing is, right? I mean, right. When you go to the store and pay with $100 bill or a $10 bill, they look at it, they scratch it, they look at it in the light because they know what the reality looks like. So if our people are well versed in what the scriptures teach, have a good, sound biblical reading, biblical theology, which leads to systematic theology, and then practicing it, I think they'll be well suited and prepared for what is a woman, what is a man. Why are there only two? I mean, it makes sense that, according to the cultural mandate, God said, populate and fill the earth. Somebody may say, well, now we have test tube babies who have all this stuff. Yeah, but still, destroy all that stuff. And what you're left after it is only men and women. Those are the only two who can populate. So, yeah, we got to be careful because it's so easy to give into the culture and even to the polarization that is out there.
Very good, gentlemen. As we kind of bring this sort of to, as we start tying things up over here, I want to talk about the church's role. Okay. And I actually remember, this is kind of the behind the scenes that I'm sharing here on the podcast. When I first sent out the original emails, there was one point in there where I mentioned what is the relevance of the church to the culture. And my buddy Carlos did not like that point at all. But I don't want to frame your words for you. I want you to tell me why you didn't like it, which I think your points are relevant, but your very response itself was the answer to the question, which I think Stephen brought out. So I want you guys to kind of explain that
right?
What do we, because to me the question is about the distinction between the ought and the is, right? With the Christian church ought to be relevant to the culture, but the question is it relevant to the culture to the degree that it ought to be? And so that's kind of the seesaw, if you will, of that question. So what is the church's role in the relevance of Christianity or the Christian faith in our modern times, and what does that look like? Stephen, go. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was actually trying to go back to the emails and find out what I said in response to Carlos's objection at that point because I forgot already. But and I mean, of course, the church is relevant, right? The church is relevant because theologically, I'll start theologically, of course. Okay, God said that he was going to bless the world through Abraham's seed. Now, of course, we know in Hebrew the word seed, it's dual. It's both plural and singular. And so I think he meant Israel and I think he meant Jesus, right? So through Israel, the nations are going to be blessed, and that comes specifically through a single Israelite, the God-man Jesus. And so then Jesus does his thing for us, double alien imputation, penal substitutionary atonement, all that good stuff that we needed to be saved. He dies for us. He raises on the third day. He sends to the right hand of the Father, and he commissions us, right? And so what he called, and keep in mind, all 11 apostles that were left at that point, which was the start of his church, they were Hebrew. The first 3,000 believers, Hebrew. The next 5,000, Hebrew. Then you get Cornelius, right? And then you have the Jerusalem Council. And so what it seems, and pretty much what Paul describes in Romans chapter 11, is that the Gentiles are being grafted in to the tree, to that, in Abraham's the root. So as the church, we've been called to do what? To go into all the nations, preaching the gospel, to bring the people of the nations and graft them into this. And so in him, in Christ, all the nations will be blessed. The church is relevant because that's our mission. That's our mission. You have the Great Commission and you have the Great Multitude in Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. And everything in between is the church. The church is the one that's getting the gospel to the lost so that the great multitude will come to fruition. So that being said, we have to exist because we have this mission, and prophecy is going to be fulfilled through that. Now, where you get disagreement is you'll have the post-millennial folks will say, well, the way that we also bring that blessing to the nations is by bringing theonomy to them, which would be God's law. I don't hold that position, but I hold an Augustinian position, which isn't completely against it. It's the idea that, like leaven, we will grow. We will permeate our society with the Judeo-Christian ethic, with the worldview of the Bible, and it will make our society flourish more. But the problem is eventually every society turns its back on it, crumbles, falls, and then it starts all over again. We've seen it with the Roman Empire. We've seen it with Europe. We've seen it with America. And so that would be the difference, I would say, between an Augustinian and a classic post-millennialist. So how does that answer the question of us being relevant? We are going to be that leavening agent. We have to speak God's truth to this culture that is trying to self-destruct, blow itself up. We have to be the ones where when these people who are mutilating their bodies and taking these hormones, when they finally realize it has not given them what they wanted, and now they're living in the aftermath, where their bodies are ruined, we have to be the hospital for them that's going to receive them and really put the spiritual balm on their wounds. So the church is always going to be relevant, not only in preaching the gospel, but also ministering Jesus's mercy to those who are hurting, but also serving as God's prophet to Caesar, telling Caesar, you can't go any further than this. You're wrong. And so, I hope that answered the question. It was more abstract the way I was going with it. But yeah, there's never going to be a time where we're not going to be relevant, because what the church is does not change.
Carlos.
Yeah, and I remember when I was saying my objection to it, that was essentially the thing, right? That the church is always relevant, that the non-believer is not going to be the judge of whether the church is relevant or not. But all that to say, mentioning this idea of how the Gen Zers tend to be a type of people that are communal, and that they're concerned with relationships. Interestingly, I was reading that they mention how they tend to almost even bring in people of different ethnicities, which is different from other cultures where they saw themselves as homogenous, right? Either they were all Mexican or all Korean, all white. That's something that's interesting. And I see something about the church that, again, is always relevant, but I'm looking at it from the doctrine of adoption more so. We can learn something from the doctrine of adoption in our evangelism, in that these people are wanting to be in community. What is the church? We know that it's not a building, it's not an institution. It is instituted by God, but it is the people of God who have been saved and brought into family, where you can actually have a true bond that goes beyond any color, any blood, any ethnicity, where we come together. Joseph Hellerman wrote a book called The Church as Family, and he
When
kind
the
of gives
church was
us,
a family, right?
and so this book is really good because it gives you the theological, the historical, and the practical version of what does it look like for the church to be family. And so the doctrine of adoption does that. God saves you, and we see this in Galatians chapter 4 verses 4 through 7, right, where it says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that they might receive adoption as sons. The way to adoption, you have to go through justification to be made right, to become regenerated, to become adopted. So I think there's something there where the church itself can, you mentioned, Stephen, that it's the balm that heals, where you come to have a true family, not something in cyberspace, not something in isolation with your phone, because we Christians are not supposed to be in isolation. I think it was R.C. Sproul who said we're not undercover secret agent Christians, but we're supposed to be the family. So I think that's something very important. So yeah, the church is relevant for many of the reasons that Stephen said, but also, again, it will never fail. The gates of hell will never prevail. And so the church is family. And I think there's something that, when they see what Christians are truly like, and they see the love of God amongst us, and as it flows outward, I think there's something to that, right? Not just
Yeah, I think
esoteric, but it has to be practical
right.
and
Yeah, I
everything
think
flows
that's
in.
right. I think even for a lot of Christians, when they think about that particular scripture verse that you mentioned, Carlos, I think we kind of get this. The feeling you have is that we are on the defensive, but that scripture actually seems to point out that the church is on the offensive. It's the gates of hell that won't prevail against the church, right? So that means the church is on the offensive move. But no, both of you guys are talking about something that reminds me of, what the historian Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, the historian Tom Holland talks about in Dominion, right? And the fact that the impact of Christianity on world history and culture is obvious through the hand of service, in the many ways in which the Christian church has served culture in many ways. Like, even like, I'm from India. I was born and raised in the Middle East. I lived in India, but you see so many Christian organizations that are doing radical work out there, and it is that kind of service oriented um, love, if you will, or theology, if you will, that actually has drawn people into the Christian faith. But go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was wanting to add one thing because I did find what I mentioned in that email, and I'd be remiss. I think that one of the problems isn't just explaining to the world the relevancy of the church. I mean, everything that's been said shows that. And in, even what you were saying, the historical record, universities, hospitals, global literacy, that's all on the church. I think our big problem right now is convincing self-proclaiming believers of the relevancy of the
Right,
church.
right.
And so one of the big issues is because of COVID and the rise of streaming. And by the way, none of this would have ever made sense if not for the seeker sensitive model anyway. When the idea is that your commitment is minimum and you're here to watch, well, then if that's your understanding of the church, why can't you watch from home? I mean, all you were doing was sitting in a chair anyway. So we have to reclaim biblical ecclesiology. There are 42 commands in the New Testament that have the word one another in them. And you can't do those commands if we're not together. Just like Christ ministered to us in an incarnational way, the word became flesh. Our ministry is to be incarnational, not just us out in the community, but us gathering with each other frequently, doing those one another's. You have Romans 12. You have 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14. You've got, I believe it's 1 Peter 3 or 4. You have so many passages speaking of the fact that the church can't be what it's supposed to be if we're actually not using our gifts to build each other up. And so a Christian can't be what a Christian's supposed to be apart from the local church. They go hand in hand with, if you don't have a body of people that is yours, that you're in covenant with, that you're responsible for, that you're serving incarnationally, then you are not growing as a Christian, and you're not doing many of the definitional things that go with being a Christian. So the church isn't just relevant for what we could do for the lost and for the world. The church is relevant because of what it is. It's a body. It's a living spiritual organism where every part matters. And when we just separate ourselves because, oh, I could be pastored by podcasts, I could just listen to John MacArthur, I don't need to listen to this nobody at this local church. No, at that local church, that person will know you, that person will pray for you, that person will hold you accountable, and so forth. There's just so many things that, let's just put it this way. If you are not an avid, essential part of a local church, you are in sin and you're not functioning as a Christian. So the church is relevant just for us to be what we are as Christians, if that makes sense.
Right. No, go ahead, Carlos.
I was just going to add something along with what Stephen is saying. I think that's very important about the church, right? It makes me think of when Jesus in John chapter 17 talks about, in the way the Father sent me, I send you. And he breathed on them the Spirit, and he tells them to go and do. And you see the Great Commission, right? He sends them. And that has the basis in the life of God and the Trinity, in the life of himself. And the Son comes from the Father, and the Spirit comes from the Father and the Son. That's that concept of sending. I think that's very important, that the church is that local body. And we've seen a lot of these celebrity pastors and other people who do fail because they're not attached to the local church. You can't be a loner in that sense, but it is where we benefit and help one another grow. Now that we don't stay in that bubble though, right? And here's that where the culture change happens too. I think I used to go to this mega church here locally in Victorville, and one of their models was changing the world for Christ. You can't do that if you stay localized in a bubble. You can't do that if you're alone watching a podcast, right? As you mentioned, or listening, reading books by yourselves. The person who's in the pews, they're actually also in a world where they're working, whether they're car salesmen, whether they're teachers, whether they're lawyers, whether they're judges, their moms, dads. So you see the effect of the church building one another, so that they go and do spread the gospel, right? Not just the missionary that goes to Uganda, which is very important. We have to send people out there to the places where word has never been heard, but even in your local vicinity, because it started locally and they expanded outward. I think that's important too, to think about, that the church is prevailing, will prevail. And so the people expand outward so that we can influence every aspect of society and bring it into submission to Christ, right? And so there's that benefit of being in the local church. And then we don't stay there. We go out and we're sent out to bring Christ to every aspect of life. And that's why I mentioned you see life through the vision or through the lens of Christianity, where you see, how am I going to conduct business as a car salesman? How am I going to be the best teacher as a Christian? How am I going to point my children to Christ? How am I going to be the judge that judges fairly? How am I going to be the politician that exemplifies Christ? And therefore it comes from the inside outward,
And if I could just add to that, 1 Corinthians 7, Paul makes the argument that stay in the position in which you were called. He starts with, hey, if you're a Gentile, don't become a Jew. If you're a Jew, don't become a Gentile. If you're a slave, don't obsess about becoming free. Now, if he says, if the opportunity avails itself, take it. If you're single, don't obsess about getting married. If you're married, don't obsess about. The point that Paul is making is, God has strategically and sovereignly placed each believer, not only with their local church, but also around people in the community. If you're a slave, you have been strategically and sovereignly placed around a bunch of other slaves and some masters. It's same thing with work. You work in a hospital. I used to work in a school, so we equip our people at church because they have already been hand placed by God in a spot where unbelievers are all around them that already know them, right? So it's not like the awkwardness of talking to a stranger. They already know you, and the Lord's already delivered them into your hand. You've got an audience. You just got to step out and speak the gospel to them. And that's one reason why Paul is so adamant about not trying to obsess over changing your social circumstance. You're in that spot, not for you, but for all those elect that don't know Christ yet that are in that same vicinity. You're God's missionary to them. So yeah, it follows that that principle of the sending out that you were talking about. We're all sent out where we are, and is by God's design. And we need the local church to equip us, but then we need to do what we've been called to do out in that area.
Right. No, that's a very thought-provoking point. Earlier, Stephen, when you were talking about the seeker-sensitive movement, I almost feel like you understated it. I think that the level of damage that the seeker-sensitive movement has done to evangelicalism is preposterous. It's really bad because the movement is seductive in the sense that it creates this sort of this vibe that if we meet your needs, then eventually you will trust us, right? And so then they start producing all this. All the churches are running programs on how to manage your money and how to be good parents and how to raise your kids right and all these kind of things. And all those kind of things are good. And the hope is that, oh well, if we meet your practical needs, then when we finally get to the gospel, you'll actually believe us. But like Al Mohler once said in one of his talks, we actually never eventually get to the gospel. And so you have, all these Christians who are supposed to be feasting on filet mignon and they're still drinking milk from a sippy cup, And so that's one of the problems. But also, I have another buddy of mine, Jacob Daniel. He's also Indian, but he and I have been talking about the Easternization of the West and how there's a lot of Eastern cultural phenomenons that we're starting to see make a huge resurgence into Western culture. And that has some negatives that come with that. But I also think what it's doing is it's destroying, or it's pulling at the threads of radical individualism that is very unique to the West. And so that is, I think it's going to unravel this whole sort of rights-oriented systems that we have created here. Even within American evangelicalism, there's a lot of entitlements, right? When a seeker-sensitive movement is saying, here's the things, here's how we want to meet your needs, we're communicating that your needs take first precedence, right? And so people start to think, okay, what does Christianity have to offer me? Which is completely a backwards question. And there's this whole concept of duties and responsibilities. Even with my children, I always tell them responsibility takes first place over rights. Your rights come later. Don't worry about your rights. What are your duties? What are your responsibilities? And so I think that for us, the Christian orientation for that comes from a place of being obedient to the scriptures, being obedient to the words of Jesus. Abide in me. Jesus talks about this all the time. And so, and I think that's a very good anchor point for where we can start from when we talk about our relevance to the culture. Last thoughts, words, gentlemen.
Yeah, if I could go back to one of because it relates to what you just said, but go back to the question about Gen Z, and one of, not so much a challenge, but one of the benefits. So, and of course, bringing this together with the whole critical theory stuff. So you have critical theory being pushed. When we were up and coming, like in our 20s, we're dealing with just standard postmodernism. There is no moral absolute. And you would talk in circles around with people when you're trying to get them to understand that. The baffling thing about critical theory, which by and large has been embraced by Gen Z without them even knowing it, but the baffling thing about it is it agrees with postmodernism that there's no truth, all claims to truth are somehow a bid for power. But at the same time, they believe their positions are objectively true, and they have moral outrage against those who disagree with their position. And I think that's good, because since they take their moral outrage seriously, and they believe some things are universally right, and there's this arc of history that everything is being driven towards, even though they can't justify it, we now can speak to them in terms of absolutes as if absolutes are real, because they're speaking as if absolutes are real. And so I wanted to at least come back and circle around with that and say, although we find this whole thing to be annoying, it is a blessing. It's kind of like somebody said, if you're close enough to hit me, I'm close enough to hit you. And so the same sword that they're swinging at us, it can be used to cut them.
It cuts both ways, right?
It cuts both ways. And so as believers, we have to definitely just have our mind sharpened to be able to see those opportunities to do that. And again, these fresh opportunities that come our way because of this next generation, I think are going to help undo some of that bad stuff. Because I think you're right. The seeker sensitive, it thrashed the church. And as Eastern communal ways are making inroads here, it's running into what you're going to have is this big contradictory mismatch where people are going to be affirming their individual rights, but also demanding some sort of communalism. I don't know what that's all going to look like, but I know as the church, we've already, if we do things right, we have the perfect balance of this. We are a body, we are a people, but we're also individuals made in the image of God. And so I think we could, again, show that we model those transcendental preconditions of intelligibility better than any other fake version of this out there that the world's going to push. So be my
Right. No, I think that's a good point. And I also like how you talked about, the importance of stating absolutes with courage, because I think that's what's going to short circuit the whole, the whole Cartesian worldview of I think, therefore I am, which we have swallowed wholesale here, and everything, all the critical theory stuff and all that is sort of, hanging around on that as ornamentation. But yeah, ultimately, just this recognition that, hey, what you believe doesn't define who you are. There is such a thing as objective truth. There is such a thing as objective morality. And guess which is the only system that provides a legitimate framework for all of those things and holds it together, and that is the Christian faith. Wonderful, wonderful, guys. Carlos, any last thoughts? And Stephen, I
Yeah,
want to give you the last word in terms
sure.
of any last words of encouragement for other pastors, but also other Christians. Carlos.
Let me finish with this. I think that this is a culture of death, and we find ourselves in a culture of death that cannot sustain itself. It's contradictory. Eventually, it's like cancer. It kills itself off and it kills off the host. And so we who have been made alive by the Spirit, who are led by the Spirit, are supposed to take up and lead. And so, as one once said, I don't know who it was, but he says the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And what sadly is that the church, in some places, and people, because of their theological position, whether it's eschatology, whether it's just easy believism, whether it's the seeker-friendly movement, they've actually stepped back and left the public square. And so we need to make sure that we're engaged. We need to speak the truth with love and compassion without compromise. And so we're to be about our Father's business. And the question is, by what standard ought we to live? By the culture, by the world, or by God's law, by God's word? And so, yeah, that's what I would say.
Good word, brother. Stephen.
Yeah. So as an encouragement to pastors and well, I guess I'll start there. Simply put, be an authentic Christian under shepherd. And what that means is you need to be teaching robust, exegetical, expositional sermons week after week to your people. Don't buy in and drink the Kool-Aid of the seeker sensitive movement that you can only preach for 20 minutes or you lose their attention. Again, when I went to that youth camp, I was told these kids can't pay attention more than 30 minutes. I had them for an hour and 15 minutes. Here's for the second lecture. The first lecture was like an hour and the third lecture was like 55 minutes. Here's the thing. If you're credible, people are going to listen. And as long as what you have to say is important information and relevant to them, they're going to keep listening regardless of how long you've been going. Okay, so get rid of all these dumb ideas that the world puts in our head, be the subject matter expert, know what you're talking about, and communicate it well. Rhetoric is important. So when you communicate, make sure you're hitting the logos, the ethos, and the pathos. All those good things, because what you're doing is you're taking truth, but you're communicating it towards three different parts of how we think and how we feel. And so be good at what you do. People will listen. The only reason people think you can only preach for 20 minutes is because, and if you feel like if your people are only able to pay attention for 20 minutes, it's because you suck, for lack of a better term. You're not doing your job. You're not credible. So as a pastor, put the work in for the word. That's the most important part of what we do. It will filter into everything else, right? So that would be my big exhortation. My encouragement would be, take cheer. Our Lord has conquered the world. We are going to win. So just as Prashanth said, it's not that we're being attacked. It's the gates of Hades cannot prevail against us. We're on the offense. Just take up the offense and go out there and do what you're supposed to do. And then for the average Christian, same thing I said to the pastors, I could say to you that be excellent at what you do for the Lord. Be excellent. Be a good representative of Christ, but also take your stewardship seriously. If you have kids, you are God's appointed protector of them to raise them in the fear and admonition of the Lord. If you don't do it, somebody else is catechizing them, and it's Taylor Swift, and it's social media, and it's all that. So take your role seriously. There's nothing more important than the role of the parent in the home. It's more impactful than the pastor at the pulpit. It's more impactful than the president at the White House. So take your role seriously, be excellent at what you do, and be good at presenting the gospel, and speak the gospel to those in your workplace. Again, we're gonna win. The one thing that I heard this once when I was first becoming reformed in my soteriology, that the fact that Jesus said all that the Father gives to him will come should make us all confident, bold evangelists. If they will come, if the
Right.
Father gave them to Christ. So we just got to go out there and open our mouths.
That's right. That's right. No, I like your word of exhortation to pastors. Yeah, I forget it is Carlos. Maybe you can remind me. I think it's Kevin Lewis who said this about teachers and pastors. He said, "Look, be clear about what you teach, because if I think he said if it's a mist in the pulpit, it's a fog in the pews. And so if you are not clear about what it is you're saying from the pulpit, then you can be assured that people listening to it are not going to get anything out of this." Well, guys, wonderful. As usual, we always run out of time. And some of the things we talked about, there's so many other things I wanted to talk about, and we just don't have the time. I think all of our wives probably want us back by now. So we should do that. Let's wrap this up. It's been wonderful to have you. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate the wisdom, and we should have you back sometime, brother.
Thanks for having me, brother. And anytime, I'd gladly come back.
Absolutely. Carlos, again, man, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy guy and you got lots of little kids. I can definitely appreciate that. So I appreciate you making the time.
Hey, man, it was a wonderful time with you guys. I loved it.